Right now, New Zealand has a system through Working for Families where, I guess I'll step back. Suppose that the government wishes to ensure that wages paid to those sort of at the bottom of the wage distribution are higher than they otherwise would be. It's got two basic mechanisms for doing that. It can use regulatory measures like minimum wages, or it can use on-budget expenditures to transfer money to those who are on lower incomes. Using regulatory approaches like the minimum wage have costs and benefits. When you increase the cost to employers of hiring workers who are either riskier or have worse productivity characteristics, you might expect that employers will react in a few ways. You might expect that they would react by reducing their costs of employing people on other margins, by reducing other kinds of benefits, for example. You might expect that they will be more risk-averse in their hiring practices, that they will be looking for people who they're more sure will be worth the pay that they're giving, rather than taking a punt on somebody who might be a little bit riskier. And they might shift to automation rather than employing people on worse productivity characteristics. So those are the things that employers can do in response to a minimum wage increase. And those kinds of responses are why MB's forecasts will typically expect that there's some disemployment effect from increasing the minimum wage, and especially when the minimum wage rises to a higher fraction of the median wage. That's how we should always really view these things, how the minimum wage relates to the wage that's paid to somebody at the middle of the income distribution. All right. The other problem that you've got when you're using a minimum wage is that it's fairly poorly targeted. There are a lot of workers on the minimum wage who are sort of not in low-income households, or at least not in the lowest-income households. You'll have plenty of workers who are, the stories that usually motivate increases in the minimum wage are stories of the worker on two jobs at minimum wage trying to support a family. That represents a pretty small proportion of those who are receiving the minimum wage. There was work done by Gail Pacheco and Tim Maloney at AUT a few years back, and it'd be really interesting to see any updated figures on it, but I haven't seen them. What we knew at the time, and I think that this was circa 2010, but I would have to check back. I'm going from memory on this now. Yeah. Substantial portions of those on minimum wage were either young workers in higher earning families, so like a 17-year-old getting a part-time job while living with their parents, yeah, or a second earner returning to the workforce after some time out of the workforce while they're the primary earner that's earning a lot more. And a lot of minimum wage workers are in those circumstances. When you've got those together, and we think back to firms' responses to minimum wages, it's a safer bet for a company to hire somebody who's coming back into the workforce after some time out, doing a bit of part-time work, than it is to take a punt on a lower productivity, lower education kid that's just getting their start. Yeah. So that's a bit of a risk there. The alternative that we've got is wage subsidies. So what we have right now is Working for Families, and that's somewhat modeled on America's Earned Income Tax Credit system. The premise there is that we want to direct public resources to supporting earners at the bottom who are in lower income households rather than just lower income workers who might be in higher earning households, and especially when they're trying to support children. Now, that means that you have to apply for Working for Families. If you've got, it's based on your household income, so it takes into account how much everyone in the household earns, and it takes into account the number of kids. So depending on your earning circumstances, you'll get a substantial top-up to your paycheck from the government through Working for Families. Now, that kind of mechanism doesn't discourage employers from hiring people. It's better targeted because it's looking at overall family income rather than just your own personal income. And you might worry a lot less about disemployment effect as a consequence. So I prefer using that kind of a mechanism for low-income support rather than ones that risk hurting the people they're trying to help. There'll be some people who are helped by a minimum wage increase. Those are the ones who continue working and who haven't seen a decrease in hours as a consequence and haven't seen decreases in other aspects of their work contract as a consequence. But there will be others who will see fewer hours, worse overall conditions, or potentially being disemployed. Now, it hasn't had that much bite yet because we're still in a very strong employment market, but I worry about what happens come the next recession.
Yeah. I think, as you pointed out, small businesses are the ones that are affected most, and they constitute, I saw 97% of business in the country. Do you think it's something that the government kind of looks past, as well as the fact that different areas have different living wages?
You're right that the minimum wage is a pretty blunt tool where living costs will vary substantially across the country. It is much easier to live on the minimum wage in some places than in others. I'm not sure that the government has had that much of a focus on regional differences or on differences between smaller and larger firms. They've been more interested in getting the minimum wage up to a particular level on a fairly sharp time path. And hopefully we don't have an intervening recession that will make that have some substantial consequence.
Yeah.
It's certainly true that some businesses might be able to afford it, while others would have a much harder time. They will all respond in their own ways to the changes in prices. There could be some, like you can imagine, lower turnover hospitality businesses that can't afford to have serving staff anymore. With a minimum wage has risen too high, so some of those might then shut down. I'm not sure that we should welcome that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The workers who were there employed would have been happier being employed than not. Otherwise, they wouldn't be working there.
Yeah.
People enjoy being able to get food in places where they otherwise might not be able to. You'll sometimes hear that like minimum wage hikes can force productivity increases because they encourage automation and the like, but that's not the kind of productivity growth that we should really be aiming at. Real productivity growth comes when if we get enough demand for labor that wages start pushing up just because a lot of people really need workers, and there's then real scarcity of labor, and if that induces more automation and more ways of coming up with labor-saving innovations, that's a real productivity increase. If people have shifted into those because regulations have made it impossible to hire people at wages that they'd be willing to accept in tasks that the employer would find worthwhile at those prices, that's kind of it's a false economy to see that as a productivity increase relative to the median wage when set in international context. If we look at what's been going on in the United States, the literature there shows pretty small employment effects actually of minimum wage hikes within the range of minimum wages that America has. So it's then pretty easy to conclude that, well, maybe minimum wages don't have much of an effect. But folks making those kinds of calls are ignoring that the minimum wage in the U.S. is typically less than 40% of the median wage, and here we're going to be hitting about 71-72% of the median wage when the minimum wage rises where to the level that labor's trying to get it to. So it can be easy to draw incorrect inferences by looking at what's been going on in the American literature and in the American cases. It's also pretty easy to be optimistic about that you'll be one of the ones who gets the wage increase but doesn't see any of the adverse consequences down the track if the business winds up contracting its employment or laying people off come the downturn or reducing its hiring. People talk sometimes about insider-outsider models of labor markets and regulation where insiders, those who already have jobs, can be pretty happy to support regulations that improve their own position because they've already got a track record, right? And they're less risky because the employer already knows them. And with regulations that make it harder for new people coming in to get their start. So it doesn't have to be the case that these guys are misperceiving these effects. It's just that they haven't thought much about the effects for new people who'd be coming in seeking employment.
Yeah. I saw in the latest MOB Business Model Snapshot that 26% of businesses' revenue had fallen, 47% remained static. Well, like only 27% expected the economy to get better. Do you think that the kind of pessimism sort of thing is just considering the loss in revenue?
I haven't looked really closely at those statistics, so I'd be reluctant to comment much on them.
Yeah.
I know that the business confidence surveys for New Zealand for overall confidence in the economy tend not to be that great a predictor of later economic activity, but businesses' expectations about their own growth and their own employment tend to be a little bit better. There are lots of worrying things on the international horizon around trade wars, and if we had substantial drops in tourist flows or in some of our export markets because of what's going on internationally, that could spark a downturn here. Certainly, I'm not a macro forecaster, and I'm very skeptical about people who claim to be able to do that sort of thing. But there are risks out there, and I'm still nervous about the push to the levels of minimum wage that the government has been wanting to get to. Well, Germany until very recently had no minimum wage, and nobody really considers Germany to be a country that's ever had problems in labor standards, right?
Yeah.
I think New Zealand's minimum wage is too high. It's particularly binding in some particular cases. So when it became a lot more difficult to run a sheltered workshop, for example, and pay people who have severe disabilities on a lower pay scale, where the point of the employment is more about dignity and giving people something to do than about providing a salary, a lot of people were really harmed by that sort of thing. I don't know that there were any harms in Germany from not having had a minimum wage. It's not like employers would ever pay zero, right? We don't have a minimum price for most other things in the economy, really, unless you want to consider excise on some products as being a minimum price de facto. But prices of these things aren't zero. They're set by the interplay of supply and demand, and in the employment case, it's employers competing for workers and workers competing for jobs, and the relative scarcity of skills and their necessity to different kinds of employment is what ends up determining wage rates and the productivity that those workers provide in the firm. I don't think that you need minimum wages to ensure reasonable standards.
Do you think that New Zealand could get away without one, or?
I don't think that it's within the realms of any. It's not something that's within the realms of political discourse in New Zealand. It's just what you can at least hope for is that minimum wages don't get set at levels that will cause substantial harm. I worry that we are getting into those ranges, and we should worry about the areas where we know that they do more substantial harm, and that's in areas around sheltered workshops and in things like the abolition of the differential lower youth minimum wage that used to be more easily accessible. So paying starting out workers at a lower rate.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that can and should be done in improving the education system. We've been doing some of that work using sort of big data approaches and the integrated data infrastructure for evaluating how well the different schools are doing, the different high schools are doing relative to each other. And the point of it is it isn't to create any new league tables, but rather so that school boards can tell how well they're doing and help in governance and improving practice, so that the ministry and ERO can identify schools that are doing that look to be doing particularly well, and then go in to see if they have any practices there that are particularly good that could be spread to other schools that are having a harder time in doing well for their students. There's all kinds of opportunity for improving outcomes that way. We've also been thinking a little bit about improving the vocational pathways that could be really beneficial for a lot of kids.
Sweet.